Chag Sameach, as I presuppose that most of you know that today is considered a holiday, and it seems like maybe only in Jerusalem, as we will shortly hear from the Talmud, that today, Tet Vav B'Av, or the 15th day in the Hebrew month of Av, is a day that the Talmud, which I shall shortly quote, while most times I usually refer to the Zohar or to the Ari's writing. Tonight we will go one step to a higher level, meaning a more mystical level, which is the Talmud. In other words, less understood than Kabbalah. But because it is a special day, it is one of those occasions that I draw some of our references to the Talmud. So before we make our connection to the upper levels of consciousness of this particular holiday, called the 15th day of the month of Av, I would like to quote from the Talmud, which discusses this particular day. And I quote, and this is in the tractate Bavli, Babylonian Talmud, in the tractate which is Tanit, the subject that deals with the fast days. And I quote, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Lo haya yomim tovim li Yisrael k'chamisha asa ba'av. There were never days as good for the nation of Israel, and obviously when it says it was good for the nation of Israel, then it is good for the entire world. K'chamisha asa ba'av, like the 15th day of Av, uki Yom HaKippurim, and also as Yom Kippurim. Shebehem benot Yerushalayim yotzot b'kli lavan shu'olin, the daughters of Jerusalem, would go out in their white clothes, which were borrowed. Shelo labayesh et mi she'en lo. They would borrow so as those who did not have clothes of white, of the color white, or simply didn't have the money to purchase these kind of clothes, everyone would lend to others so that no one would be embarrassed. In other words, this particular aspect of borrowing one from another so as not to embarrass those who do not have is rarely mentioned elsewhere. Ubenot Yerushalayim yotzot v'cholot b'kramim, and they go out and they dance in the vineyards. U'mahayu omrot bachur sana einecha urei ma'ata boreh lecha, and they would say to the young people, raise up your eyes and see which do you want to choose. But do not choose al titein einecha benoi, just in the beauty of the woman, but tein einecha b'mishpacha, make certain about the family, and many other aspects. And then the Mishneh goes on to say other aspects of what one should be seeking. This is the holiday of Tu B'Av, and this is where it's first mentioned, aside from being mentioned also in the Ari. Now there are several questions that obviously comes to the mind of most of us. Firstly, what was so special about this particular day that it was considered a day of simcha, that there was no day like today, but they also include the day of Yom Kippur. In other words, this is the day that people would find their soulmates. This was a day that was almost assured that everyone was going to wind up in a very happy marriage. Why this particular day? Why not some other day? What is the significance that prompted this Tana, this sage, to make this kind of declaration? And then he says, Yom HaKippurim. He also includes Yom HaKippurim on the same level of today. And so the Ari, which I will quote here, brings the reason for the mention of the day of Yom Kippurim on an equal status of Tu B'Av, the 15th day of Av, is because on this day, when someone marries a woman, L'Shem Shemayim, and we know what L'Shem Shemayim means, and for those of you who do not know what L'Shem Shemayim means, it means that the reason for marrying is not only for the sake of the desire to receive for oneself alone, but in this marriage they consider to see, as we have learned in the Talmud Sefirot, they see within this consummation of a marriage a consummation of the cosmos. In other words, an action done on the lower level, done on the lower plane, also initiates and triggers an action on a higher level, on a higher plane. In other words, if there is unification, a perfect unification on this level, then we initiate a perfect unification on the upper level, in the cosmos, in the celestial realm, where all the action takes place. L'Shem Shemayim, Shemayim meaning, from a Kabbalistic, it is a coded message for heavens, which means Za'ir Ampin. In other words, within this marriage, there will not be only for the sake of the desire to receive for oneself alone, but it is L'Shem Shemayim. It is for the sake of also sharing to the entire universe, not only the entire world, not only creating a marriage that all peoples can be present, and we know what that usually means. Everyone's going to be very happy, and of course, in more times than none, there are more fights that evolve from which location and who's going to be the rabbi, and many other aspects that ultimately so much negativity finds itself seeping into what is so-called a perfect marriage. No, this would be L'Shem Shemayim. This would be for the sake of the heavens. And what happens when that is the case? Then states the tractate Yerushalmi, as opposed to Bavli, that all of the sins on the day of marriage, if this is the meditation, and this is the concentration, and this is the objective of marriage in the minds of these people, that not only is there the feeling of self-gratification in marrying a suitable partner, and not that there is any intent on the part of the sages to say that this aspect of being comfortable and marrying someone who you would feel comfortable and feel gratified with and feel an emotional completion, but there is also other objectives. In other words, there are higher levels of consciousness that are associated and are connected with this particular phenomena called marriage. And if this was the intent of both parties, then all of the sins that had ever been perpetrated by either of the parties would completely be nullified and canceled. That is the connection with Yom HaKippurim. In other words, there seems to be, just like on Yom Kippurim, all of the sins supposedly are canceled and nullified. Therefore, this is somehow the connection between the two. This is what the Ari declares in his Pri Etz Chaim, volume number 2. But that doesn't totally satisfy us in its connection with Yom Kippurim. Yom Kippurim is a day we pray and so forth. And therefore, if we are successful with our prayers, we can achieve success in that all of our sins are canceled. However, this is discussing seeking out one's partner. They're not getting married that day. Maybe they would get married that day, but that was not the principle that was associated with Tu B'Av. This was the day that they would find their soulmates. And I don't believe that the day they found their soulmates, they made their wedding. They still would want others to participate, the families and so forth, maybe even ask approval. So what does this connection with Yom Kippur have to do with Tu B'Av? Furthermore, to look closely at the words of the Talmud, it says, Lo hayu yamim tovim liYisrael b'chamisha kimo, this 15th day of Av. But there was another day, in fact, that even supersedes the rejoicing and the joy of a holiday, and that was, of course, Purim. To the extent that Yom Kippurim, the highest holiday, is referred to as a day which almost, because it doesn't say it is Purim, it says that Yom Kippur is like Purim, obviously indicating that Purim seems to indicate a higher level of consciousness, a higher level of joy. And how come there is no mention of Purim at all in this tractate? It is not by coincidence that following this tractate, we have the tractate of Megillah, which deals with Purim. It follows, but it was known, when the Talmud was written, it was already following the miracle of Purim. What was so significant, and what was important about this particular day? Now, this question was also raised that even if we understood all of these connections that I've raised questions concerning, the connection, what was so significant, asks the Talmud, about this particular day. And so, I'll read it in English, and so that it would facilitate the translation of the Talmud. And they say that several other beautiful things happen on this 15th day of Av. And let us understand clearly what it means. First of all, the tribes were allowed to intermarry. Tribes were allowed to intermarry. This is referring to Numbers 36. Also, the Benjaminites were readmitted into the community. The source reference is in Shoftim, or Judges, chapter 21. A third aspect is the death of the Israelites in the Sinai desert. If you all recall that following the return of the spies with their report concerning Israel, in which they declared that Israel was not a suitable land for the nation of Israel, and they all cried, and that day was Tet B'Av, that was the day of Tisha B'Av, that they came back with their infamous report, untrue report, maybe true for some, but in any event, the Torah does not consider the report of the spies as being accurate and being correct, and that day the decree went out from the Creator that all those over the age of 20 would not be permitted to enter the land of Israel outside of Joshua and Caleb, the other two spies who returned with the proper, truthful report, accurate report, and of course a good report concerning the land of Israel. So on this day, all of the Israelites of the generation of Exodus had died. In other words, from that day on, in the 40th year, the Talmud tells us, well, how do we know that how does everyone know that that this month, on the 15th day, it was all over with? Because it says that they would always make a count after Tet B'Av, because on the 15th day of Av, for the year, each year, so many people would die. Each year. And no one else would die after the 15th day of Av. We also have to question, why would no one die after the 15th day of Av? In other words, if there were 50,000 Jews who were left that were under the decree of death because of the spy incident, when the 15th day of Av came and everyone was still alive, they knew that on the 15th day of Av they would not die. So it was a day of rejoicing. Came the next year, everyone who had to die that year, let's say the 39th year, died. When it came the 15th day, there was rejoicing because they knew they wouldn't die that day. Came the 40th year, everyone of the generation of the Exodus had already died, perished, and the 15th day therefore was a total celebration. It was all over with. No one else would die in the 40th year. And therefore, says the Talmud in the same tractate, was a reason for the rejoicing. I'll give you some of the other reasons, but I know if you have been studying Kabbalah for quite some time, the first question that should come to your mind is, true, all of these things happen in that particular day. Just as we know, as we have raised the question concerning the destruction of the Holy Temple. We know that on Tet B'Av, the 9th day of Av, great misfortunes had occurred within or to the nation of Israel. Destruction of both temples, the signing of the decree of the Inquisition, and also the removal of all Jews from Spain, and many other incidents throughout history, including the decree that all Jews of the generation over the age of 20 would have to perish. Many things happen on Tet B'Av. But our question would be, what was Tet B'Av about that caused all of these things to occur or to happen? Just as as the Talmud is now preparing for us a list of many, many joyful occasions that took place on the 15th day of Av. But we still would not be satisfied, because we would still raise the question, what was this day so special that prompted or caused the effect, these happenings, these joyous occasions to take place in the first place? Okay? Now while we're at it, I'll mention the other two. They were the last king of the Israelite kingdom, Hosea ben Elah, removed the checkpost which Yeravam the first installed to prevent the Israelites from making their pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Yeravam was a idol worshiper, and he put up roadblocks so as not to permit the Jews to go up to Jerusalem for their pilgrimage. When were the removal of all these checkposts done away with? When were the checkposts removed and done away with? Was also on this day of 15th of Av. Again, we raise the question. Why did it happen this day and not another day? And also, the Romans permitted the burial of the soldiers, says the Talmud, in the defense of Bar Kochba's last stronghold. In other words, on this day, they were all permitted burial. On the 15th day of Av, all of the fallen soldiers under the command of Bar Kochba were permitted to be buried. And then another aspect, from this day onward, no more wood was chopped for the temple because the sun was no longer strong enough to dry it. Okay? On this day, according to the halakha, there are many prayers that are omitted, many sorrowful prayers that are omitted, and there are no eulogies at burials on this particular day. Okay? That gives you the Talmudical viewpoint of why Tu B'Av is such an important festival, why it is mentioned. But again, all of the questions that we raised still remain. What was so special on this day? obviously, to receive the answer to that kind of question would not be found in the Talmud, because the Talmud is dealing, as we have always said, with the physical illusionary reality. That's why at the very outset I said that it is a great deal easier to understand the Zohar or the Ari than it is to understand the Talmud. That is for a thinking man, because the Talmud is dealing with the illusionary physical reality. It is dealing with what we call the mitzvot, the holidays, etc. And we know that it is dealing with the illusionary reality because when the Messiah comes, all of this no longer exists. Obviously, it is not eternal. If it was eternal, then what is the difference if the Messiah has come or the Messiah did not come? Why would it say that all of the mitzvot and everything else would be abolished, except, of course, for the holiday of Purim? Everything else is abolished. If it's eternal, then it could not be abolished. Something that has eternity associated with it or connected with it, then would have to remain even after a certain incident occurs, like the coming of the Messiah. So obviously, it is far more difficult to achieve a deeper insight into the Talmud because of the questions we raise, and the Talmud does not deal with that aspect as to what are the cosmic events, what is the cosmic position that prompts negativity or positivity to occur on particular days. So we know that there are certain days that are considered to be danger zones, that we should refrain from entering into new agreements, new purchases, new contracts, or moving into a new location or entering into a new business. We have learned many of these danger zones. Now on the other side of the coin, and we learn why they are danger zones. The danger zones are mentioned in the Talmud as well as the Zohar, but the Zohar takes it one step further and mentions the cosmic events that determine the negativity of, let's say, marrying Sunday night or getting married Tuesday night. It is mentioned both in the Talmud and it is mentioned both in the Zohar. These are 2 days that you refrain. You refrain from any new endeavor, entering into any new endeavor. At the same time, there are other positive zones. And if anyone had ever called me about particular days, one of the days that I would mention is Tu B'Av, the 15th day of Av. The third day of the beginning of a month is a positive zone for instilling or creating and instilling within the first action. In other words, a new business, a marriage, or whatever, is the beginning, what we call keter, what we call the crown, what we call the seed. And as you plant the seed, if it's planted with all of the positive energy that should go into the planting of a seed, you know what the results will be. Whereas on the other hand, if a great deal of negativity is being connected and associated with the beginning of that event, whether it be from a cosmic point of view or from an environmental point of view, then one should have the common sense, according to the Zohar, to refrain from entering into new ideas or new endeavors or new ventures. Tu B'Av also has something very significant. Tu B'Av, first of all, is in the month of Leo, and we have already discussed the importance of Leo on how it is one of the most, if not the most heavily negative, celestial, energizing entity in this universe, meaning the sun, without the protection of the ozone, will all perish. So tell us the astronomers, and so tell us the scientists. Sun could be very dangerous. Sun causes cancer. Sun does many things. Sun, too much sun, causes drought. Too much sun causes hunger, causes deserts, causes water supplies to dry up. Sun is very negative. And for that reason, the temples were destroyed on this day. Very heavy negative months. At the same time, we know that life cannot go on without the sun. Without the sun, life cannot go on. Sun, for whatever reason, furnishes the life essence of this universe. The sun. So, which is it? Positive or negative? Just as we know that the temples were destroyed on the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, we also know that the Messiah, who was already born on the 9th of Av. And when is he born? On the 9th of Av. A paradox. But those who have studied Kabbalah to any length know that in this world, we live in the world of paradox. It is only those who have the foresight, and more important, who are given the opportunity to acquire information, those are the ones who could benefit both from the positive aspects of a particular month like Leo, and also not fall into the traps of what Leo represents. But this paradox exists for every month, more or less. So Av obviously has its benefits, being that the planet Sun rules over this particular month, and therefore, being that heavy into a negative aspect, obviously must have the other side of the coin and must be very heavily into a positive nature. Tu B'Av is exactly on the other side of the circle. In other words, 6 months hence, or 6 months before, we have another day that is called Tu B'Shvat. Tu B'Shvat. Another day that is also celebrated as a miniature holiday. I'll say miniature holiday. The reason we say Tu B'Av is a miniature holiday, and the reason Tu B'Av is a miniature holiday, and that's why the word miniature has been connected with it, and almost no significance, because once you attach a word miniature, what you're in essence saying, well, it's not really that important, because it's only a miniature holiday. But that would be a corruption of describing the day, because it means, well, you don't have to observe much. You don't have to refrain from doing much. There are not too many positive things that the Torah prescribes on this day. And therefore, in some circles, it has been attributed to as being a miniature holiday. But that's the furthest from the truth. Because if one just examines Purim, the day that will be eternally remembered and the day which remains in eternity, what happens with Purim? Nothing to do. You can ride. In fact, Purim is just the opposite. You can get drunk, not even to know or distinguish or discriminate between cursed is Haman and, blessed is Haman and cursed is Mordechai. To that extent, you can become that drunk, not know the difference between right and wrong. Look at the holiday. So there, nothing is really required of us outside of hearing the Megillah, but we know why we hear the Megillah. Tu B'Av and Tu B'Shvat seem to have something very closely connected to each other, outside of the fact that they are exact opposites to each other. Exact opposites, but if you know the sign of Shvat, it is Aquarius. Av is Leo, meaning you have a air sign with a fire sign. So whether they're compatible goes without saying. They both complement each other. Air and fire complement each other. Tu B'Av and Tu B'Shvat are very significant days. Firstly, the fact that it is in Tet Vav, the 15th day of the month, and on several occasions we have discussed the significance of the 15th day of the month. The 15th day of the month is when the moon is completely immersed with light. It's full. There is no girayon. There is no lack. But, as some will say, well, the sun has no obstruction from the earth, and therefore it shines completely upon the moon. But when we study Kabbalah, we ask one question one step further. That may be true, but what was the cause? What was the factor that determined that the sun on this particular day would have a union with the moon? And therefore, the answer is because there is a complete merger, a complete union between the female and the male. The female being the moon, because she has no light of her own, only that which she receives. Although without the female, there will never be any manifestation of any sort. Mother Earth, while she by and within herself does not constitute the force is the seed. It is the seed that creates a tree, but without Mother Earth, without her manifestation of her negative force, negative not meaning in a sense evil, positive and negative, she ultimately becomes the channel, the viaduct by which the seed or the sperm becomes manifest. Same thing that happens on the 15th day of any month. On the 15th day of any month, it is complete, it is uniform, there is a complete union between male and female. Therefore, any day of the month, on any 15th day of any month, would be a perfect day for entering into a new venture, being married, because on that day, it is the cosmos, the celestial forces, the unseen forces, that have dictated that the moon and the sun become connected in totality, in a total unification with each other. So therefore, it is not the fact that the moon's position with the sun makes the moon's appearance as it does, meaning full, but rather there are celestial forces at work which are completely unified. And therefore we take advantage of this day, knowing that there are unified forces prevailing over the entire universe, and therefore it is suggested that one enter into a new venture in that month and so forth and so on. So the 15th day of the month, despite it might be Av, despite the fact that it is Av, a month of severe negativity, nevertheless, with information, we can draw and tap very much positive and strong, intensified positive energies during this month, of which one of those days is Tet Tu B'Av. But what makes Tu B'Av so special? You might say, well, because it's in Av. That's correct. In other words, because the sun rules on this particular day. And what does it mean? What does it mean the sun rules on this particular day? And what made a Leo the king of the rule of the kingdom? Because he's the strongest animal? Why is he called the king of the jungle? Because Leo indicates the channel, because Leo is the channel for the manifestation of the planet sun. In other words, knowing the celestial system on how it operates, forces first originate above the planets, but when they become diffused into planets, they then continue on to become manifested in our realm. They are then diffused into what is called the constellations or the signs of the zodiac. Leo is only Leo because he is the direct recipient, I mean, someone who was born during the month of Leo is a direct recipient of what the sun represents. It represents the most negative aspect of any sign of a planet, but at the same time, it is the sun that without which no life could exist. Therefore, Leo is that channel, that direct channel that makes manifest both the aspects of the sun, positive or negative. On the 15th day, the sun and the moon merge. There is a unification between the two. And therefore, the significance of this day is that because Leo and the sun are so heavily fortified with energy to be able to cause the destruction of the world, because the destruction of the temple was indicative that the entire world went into disorder and chaos. We should never think for a moment that when it is bad for the Jews, it was just bad for the Jews and good for everyone else, or vice versa. No. And as I explained from a Kabbalistic point of view, the fate of all peoples of the world hinge upon the Jew drawing positive energy or drawing negative energy. If he is one of severe negativity, then the Jewish conspiracy is correct. It is a conspiracy because all other nations of the world will ultimately suffer the results of drawing down this intensified negative energy. However, if the Jew is one who taps positive energy, if the Jew is one who behaves in a positive manner, then he makes manifest the celestial realm in our universe, but with positive energy. And therefore, the entire universe, the entire world, all of its inhabitants begin to feel that kind of positivity. And so everyone walks around with a smile rather than with a frown. People feel content when there is positivity. When you feel good, you're positive. When you don't feel good, you're negative. It's synonymous. They work hand in hand with each other. Tu B'Av, the 15th day of the Av, when the Talmud informs us that this was the day that the bride and bridegroom would find each other. Why? Why? And why was this more significant than Purim? And why is it compared to Yom Kippurim? But with what we have just brought from the Ari, that Tu B'Av and Tu B'Shvat are very similar to each other. What is the significance of Tu B'Shvat? Briefly, we had discussed it in the past, but briefly stated, Tu B'Shvat is the holiday of the trees. You plant trees on Tu B'Shvat. It's an old custom. Why that day? Why that day? Because the cosmos, and what are trees? Knowing the kingdoms, the trees represent Ze'ir Ampin, that code, the internal energy of the tree is Ze'ir Ampin. What does that mean? It means the power of air. What does it mean, the power of air? It means if all trees were destroyed, humankind would perish. We could not exist without the benefit of trees. They say that New York could not exist if Central Park did not exist. If for some unknown reason acid rain should destroy every tree in Central Park, we would all have to move out of New York, because it is only by virtue of the benefits that trees, in their exhalation and the entire process, provides man with the air that is necessary. That is the function of the tree. that is significant of the tree. And that's why the Aquarian month is air. Why is it air? Because it had been dictated that through the Aquarian, the air aspect becomes very manifest on the 15th day. Therefore, when that is a day for the planting of trees, if it is a day for the planting of trees, that day is only, the planting of the trees is only indicative that this is a day that kind of energy, the energy of Ze'ir Anpin, the energy of sharing, becomes manifest. Tu B'Av is known as a very negative month, so stipulated in the Zohar. He mentions 3 months that one should refrain even on the 3rd day of the week. One should refrain from getting married. In other words, let us assume, like this year, the Monday night was before the 15th day, and of course everyone knows no one should ever get married after the 15th day of any Hebrew month. Because by the same token that on the 15th day of the Hebrew month, there is complete unification between the sun and the moon, meaning the cosmos are completely unified, meaning that new venture, marriage or whatever, being undertaken on the 15th day of the month has the benefits of unification. It's the kind of energy that is being imparted and also being embellished and being instilled within this kind of venture. Now, what happens if it was Tuesday? And everyone knows Tuesday is a good day. But it also depends which Tuesday, of which month. That means in this case, where Yud B'Av, the 10th day of Av, was Sunday, therefore the 12th day of Av was Tuesday. And unbeknown to many, because the Zohar says this is a very highly negative intensified month, one should refrain from entering in any period, certainly not in the 9 days. Everyone is aware of the fact that the 9 days there is no control over its negativity. The sun heats up its negative internal energies without being harnessed. There is no harness to that energy throughout the 9 days. And therefore, the least we can do is refrain from a great deal of the desire to receive for oneself alone, meaning not to increase the intensification of our desires, because whenever you have a desire, you're immediately fulfilled. But there is one problem. Is your vessel, my vessel, reconcilable with the amount of energy that is being thrust into this universe by Sun and Leo? And so we are told halachically and by the Zohar, this month, stay away from the first 9 months. Because as great as you could be, as high of a level of consciousness that you think you can achieve, you practically have to be an Ari. Rabbi Isaac Lurie, who chose the 5th day of Av to pass on to the world of reality, he maybe could get married that day. He maybe could enter into a new venture because there was complete control over his desire to receive. But everyone else, by having a desire to receive, it would come down in buckets. We couldn't handle it. That's what's called a flood. So there's flood of water, and sometimes there's flood of fire. There's flood of heat. And so we stay away. The Zohar says the entire month of Av is one of highly intensified negative energy. Negative doesn't mean bad, but it means an overflow, an overabundance, like you have too much water, if it rains too much. Water, you can't exist without water. We must drink water. Water is good for plants. Water is good for everything. Water cleans the air. But the moment you have an overabundance of water, forget it. You've got flood. So says the Zohar concerning Av, the Sun, and Leo. This month, there's an overabundance throughout the month. Throughout the month. Therefore, even on even if the 12th day of Av fell on a Tuesday, and there are many who believe, well, now we can have marriages or go into a new venture. Not according to the Zohar. He considers this entire month a danger zone. Except for one day. Except for one day. The 15th day of the month. Why? Because on the 15th day of the month, the sun and Leo become harnessed. Become unified. That is all that the Talmud is talking about here. It is telling young girls and young boys to go out and choose your partner. Because on this day, the highest form and manifestation of the sun's energy becomes manifest in a harnessed, in a reconcilable fashion manner with the vessel. So on this day, on the 15th day of the month, is the day that they went out. This was the day. That was like Purim. But what happened on Purim? Why is Purim eternal? What was so special about Purim? And we've learned, insofar as Purim is concerned, that the Jew had achieved, only those Jews who lived that time in Persia, had achieved the level of consciousness that we said was matanot levyonim. They gave gifts to the poor. They didn't give charity to the poor. They gave gifts to the poor. In other words, the sharing and the receiving. One could not distinguish or discriminate between them. Because generally when you give a gift to someone, as I've said on many occasions, when you give a gift, it is more the pleasure of the recipient taking the gift than the recipient having the pleasure. In other words, the one who is given that gift receives more pleasure by virtue of the fact that the recipient accepted the gift. That's why it's called gift. It's not called charity. If we were to present whoever is the world's richest man with $100 gift, it's obvious that it wouldn't be considered charity. And in fact, it would be a gift because he's accepting as a token of my appreciation or whatever. It is more his receiving than my giving. Therefore, on Purim, they had achieved such a high elevation, whereas the vessel had been completely transformed into one of sharing, that you couldn't distinguish between who was the giver and who was the taker. Like on the 15th day of the month. On that day, we almost cannot distinguish between the sun and the moon. Whenever we observe the sun in the morning, throughout the day, we always see a full round ball. It's a little cloudy, we can look up, we see a full round ball. You never see parts of the sun shining. It's the sun in its full grandeur. Only on the 15th day of the month, what do you see in the moon? Fully illuminated. Like the sun. Maybe not as brilliant as the sun, as Shlomo HaMelech says. The brilliance of the sun will come again to shine as brilliance of the moon will once again shine as the sun. It was only on the 4th day of creation that we are told, according to the Zohar, that the brilliance of the moon was brought down to a lower level. But it does not indicate any lack. It does not indicate a part that is defective, like we will find up until the 14th day of the month, or from the 16th day onwards, where we begin to observe defects in the moon. It is a quarter, 3/4, and never completely full except on the 15th day. So on that 15th day, it is indicative that there is no flaws, no lacks. And because Av is so powerful, because the sun and the moon are so powerful, that they have this kind of complete compatibility with each other. In other words, as much as the sun can share, the moon is capable of handling, because we do not observe a defect on that particular day. It should burn out the moon. So powerful. It's the summertime. It's not by chance that during the summertime there's so much heat. If there ever was as much heat in this part of the world as we've experienced this entire summer, which is incredible, we realized that something is happening, and hopefully good things are happening. And therefore, the Talmud says that many of the aspects, and how many aspects were there, says the Ari? 7. There were 7 manifestations. 7 good things happened on this particular day, on Tu B'Av. We could have asked another question at the very beginning. How come 7? Why not 8? Why not 5? Why not 4? 7. That's what the Talmud says. 7. Why 7? Because, if you learned a little Kabbalah, you know that in this universe, when you have a manifestation of 7 Sfirot, you then have a totality. You must have full illumination in every one of those Sfirot. So says the Ari, each one of these aspects represented a particular Sfirah, a particular fulfillment. And when it reached the 7th one, there was a total fulfillment. Because this day required a total unification of things to exist. And so it says, one of the aspects were, if you recall, the tribe of Benjamin was permitted because they had sinned, and without getting into the whole story, they were permitted to be joined with the rest of the nation of Israel. Unification takes place because this is the day of unification. So anything you have in mind or anything you want to do, this is the perfect day. Perfect day. There is, in fact, no other day other than, the Zohar tells us and informs us, when in the first day of Cheshvan. But it is not the equivalent of Tu B'Av. It is not the equivalent of the 15th day of Av. Now you say the first day of Cheshvan, says the Zohar, there is no day in the year that there is such a complete infusion of energy, of light into this universe like on that day. Now you might ask, why on that day? Because since Abraham, the patriarch, in his book of formation, the Sefer Yetzirah, declared, unbeknown to many Jews, that he labeled the month of Cheshvan, the month of Scorpio, as bitter, Mar Cheshvan. And those who still adhere to the tradition of blessing the new month on Shabbat prior to the new month, you will hear in those synagogues where it is performed, they announce Mar Cheshvan, bitter Scorpio. What's so bitter? There are many, many aspects. It's bitter because the flood began. See, the flood began during the month of Cheshvan. So therefore it's called bitter. But we know from a Kabbalistic point of view, the opposite is correct. Why did the flood begin in Cheshvan is what the question we would raise. And therefore we would say because from a cosmic point of view, the celestial forces created an environment that a flood could come into existence. They say there are no holidays during the month of Scorpio. Well, do you measure bitterness by no holidays taking place during that month? Or do you measure bitterness by hundreds of thousands of Jews being slaughtered and another couple of 100,000 of Jews being sold into slavery due to the destruction of the temple. You don't call that a bitter month. They call it, in fact, Menachem Av, the month of consolation. Month of consolation. You mean we should all be consoled? Well, then call it a bitter month, and let's hope we will be consoled. But the rabbis, again, declared Menachem Av. And if you ask most people who do this procedure in the blessing of the new month, probably don't know why we would consider Av to be Menachem. The answer is we have it now. The reason it is because it is Menachem, because there is a day, as opposed to the first day in Cheshvan, there's a tremendous infusion, more infusion than any other day, one day of the year. But that didn't necessarily mean that it is as equal to the complete compatibility as Tu B'Av. No day. What happened on Pesach, you might say, there you had a paradox. Even on Pesach, it's a happy holiday, 15th day of the month. But the 15th day of the month, of Pesach, can also be a negative month. It could also be a negative month because it also depends on how you tap the energy. You see, if you do not observe Pesach, and I'm not getting into the religiosity of it, but let's say you don't perform the Pesach the way it is, and I'm criticized by, I guess, most rabbis who criticize me today in the world, that why don't I tell you right now, remember to observe Passover the way you should, and I'm not going to tell you to do that, because if you don't feel the benefit of it, then I'm not going to be his policeman. You go do what you want, or go to some other rabbi, and he'll tell you what you have to do. I'm here to provide you with information. That's all I'm going to do, to provide you with information. On the month of Aries, that 15th day of the month, to tap the positive energy, you've got to do a lot of things. First of all, if you love bread, even, let's say, organic bread, not the enriched flour bread, right? That can hurt you. But the pure whole wheat bread, you can't eat it on Passover. You got to stick to the matzah, maybe get a little constipation at the same time, right? I mean, so many restrictions. Because if you don't do those restrictions, you're not going to tap that kind of energy. But on Tu B'Av, where you have that same kind of infusion, whereas in the month of Aries, the month of Passover, is only potential. It all depends. That moon is potentially in complete unification. However, you can tap the negative aspect of it. And so you've got to go through the ritual, so to speak, in order to be in harmony with the cosmos. That's what the Torah is teaching us. You want to be in harmony? Be in harmony. You don't want to be in harmony? Your choice. The Torah says, choose life or death. What if you consider this life or death? But choose. It didn't say you have to. It says choose. Meaning the prerogative of choosing was left to man, not to the police force of rabbis. It was never left to them. Therefore, that month, which has a complete unified formation of moon and sun in the month of Aries, nevertheless, is not there without a participation and without our actively engaging in certain communications, in certain channeling that will connect us with the 15th day of the month of Aries, the month of Nisan. But today, nothing is required. All we're going to do, beside understanding what we're doing today, all we're going to do is go and have a feast. That's all. Nothing more than that. Nothing else is required. No requirements. That's why it said, that's the day male and female goes out to choose and find their soulmate. So much happiness. Why is there so much happiness? Because if you have learned what this day is about, you're given this whole type of energy for nothing. Could there be a greater benefit? than enjoying something for nothing? When do we get this opportunity to enjoy something for nothing? But it isn't for nothing. It requires information. It requires study. It requires you being here. Now, what about the rest of the people out there? Well, that's why we're taping this. So in the future, more people will be aware of this cosmic day, this cosmic event, and will take advantage and tap this kind of energy. Purim was already the total manifestation. It was all over with. Today, you see, is different than Purim. It is not as great as Purim. Purim was all over. For those Jews who had come down, it was all over. For us, it is not over. We are at least going to take advantage, and hopefully with the enjoyment of this kind of energy that we're going to tap today, it will produce for us the kind of result that Purim resulted already in history for the Jews at that time. And so, again, Chag Sameach to all of you, and we will immediately proceed down to participate in the Su'udah. And we have an added advantage. We're going to have a Pidyon Haben, which I will explain shortly downstairs. So now everyone is invited to downstairs, but I think someone wants to make a comment.